I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as well as reporting news from the front lines, we analyse updates from the US and the EU as decisions regarding funding Ukraine's war effort loom large in Western politics. And we speak to journalist Jen Stout about her reporting from Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 4th of December. 1 year and 283 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, editor of the Central Asia and South Caucasus Bulletin James Kilner, and our guest is Jen Stout, a journalist from Shetland who's covered the war in Ukraine since March 2022. Jen specialises in long-form reporting and is also a radio producer and photographer. I started by going through the latest updates from Ukraine. Let's start in occupied Luhansk, where Ukrainian drones have reportedly blown up a Russian oil depot. Video footage released on Sunday night showed plumes of smoke billowing into the sky from the facility in the city. Russian news agency RIA Novosti reported that a fire at the depot has since been extinguished and made no mention of any casualties. Ukraine is yet to officially comment. Over the weekend, there were further drone and missile strikes across Ukraine. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 23 drones and a missile into Ukraine from occupied Crimea in the early hours of Monday. They said the Kh-59 guided missile and 18 of the Iranian-designed Shahed drones were shot down, but did not specify what damage the attacks had done. Over in the east, Russia has launched a new assault from two directions on the heavily bombarded Ukrainian town of Avdiivka. The mayor, Vitaly Barabash, said the current third wave of enemy assaults differs from the previous two in that they have conditionally opened two new directions. The launching of new directions proves that the enemy has been given a command to capture the city at any cost. Just 1,300 civilians approximately remain in Avdiivka, compared to its pre-war population of around 30,000. Across the front lines, the cold weather is starting to have an impact on both sides. This is from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, which reports that the poor weather conditions continue to slow the pace of Ukrainian and Russian combat operations across the entire front line, but have not completely halted them. They cite Ukrainian Ground Forces Command spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Volodymyr Fityo, who stated that Russian forces actively use aviation in the Bakhmut direction when the weather permits it, and that the weather does not significantly affect Russian artillery fire in the Bakhmut direction again. One Russian mill blogger quoted by the ISW noted that in western Zaporizhzhia Oblast, Russian forces can only move on tracked vehicles, and that Ukrainian forces continue intense artillery fire despite the poor weather conditions. Finally, the ISW notes that the Zaporizhzhia Oblast occupation official, Vladimir Rogov, amplified footage on December the 2nd that shows muddy roads on the Robotne-Novoprokopivka-Verbove line in western Zaporizhzhia Oblast, claiming that these conditions have practically immobilized Ukrainian wheeled vehicles, forcing Ukrainian troops to conduct infantry-only attacks. Moving on, Russia has been accused of killing two surrendering Ukrainian soldiers in an apparent war crime near the village of Stepove in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. The footage shows a group of men in Russian uniforms opening fire from close range on the unnamed pair and unarmed pair after they emerged from a dugout with their hands on their heads. The Ukrainian Army Strategic Communications Center said it possesses, quote, confirmed information, end quote, that the video showed the execution by Russian forces of unarmed soldiers. Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office said on Sunday that it launched a pre-trial investigation for violation of the laws and customs of war combined with intentional murder. There's actually been an update on this story that came out just before we came on air. The Ukrainian army has announced that the Russian soldiers accused of this crime have been killed. This comes from Alexander Stupin, spokesman for the Southern Tavria Army Group, who says, I can confirm that in the course of further hostilities, the group of Russian occupiers who committed this crime ceased to exist. Moving on, elsewhere, there's another worrying update from the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukrainian and International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA, officials have reported that the ZNPP completely disconnected from all external power sources for 5.5 hours on the night of December the 1st to the 2nd. This marks the plant's 8th complete blackout, all under Russian occupation. The ZNPP during the blackout automatically switched to diesel generators to cool its reactors and power essential functions. Ukrainian nuclear energy operator Energoatom President Petro Kotin stated that Russia is not interested in the safety of the ZMPP, as evidenced by Russian authorities' failure to follow the norms and rules of nuclear and radiation safety. The IAEA said that an external grid failure far away from the ZMPP caused the power failure, and its Director General Rafael Grossi stated that this most recent power outage is, quote, yet another reminder, end quote, about the plant's precarious nuclear safety and security situation. Turning now to look at a couple of stories about the Russian military, the British MOD is reporting that Russia could have suffered as many as 350,000 casualties. In its latest defence intelligence briefing, they say that this gives an estimated range of 290 to 350 total Russian combatant casualties. It added that a long-established culture of dishonest reporting in the Russian military has likely created a low level of understanding about total casualty figures among Russian officials and civilians. Just very quickly on that again, the Russian Defence Ministry has proposed changing rules on the calling up of civilians with health issues that, quote, do not have a significant impact, end quote, on their ability to fight. This proposal comes just days after Vladimir Putin issued an order to increase the size of the army by 170,000 people. Independent news outlet Meduza reported that the information has been published on the government's official legal portal. Their published documents do not specify the proposed changes, besides saying they are aimed at improving the current health requirements. And finally, the death of Russian Major General Vladimir Zavadsky has been confirmed by the governor of Russia's Voronezh region. I'm convinced that the name of Vladimir Zavadsky, a courageous officer, a real general, and a worthy man, will forever remain in the annals of glory of our fatherland. This comes from Alexander Gusev, who wrote on his Telegram. The reports on his death, which we covered last week in a landmine explosion, emerged after Ukrainian Colonel Anatoly Stefan and a number of pro-Kremlin Telegram channels also made the claims. However, Mr. Gusev did not comment on how Major General Zavadsky, he was the deputy commander of the 14th Army Corps, died. Just to put this in context, at least 6 other generals are thought to have died since the invasion in February 2022, and Russia is yet to officially comment on his death. Those are the updates from the front lines. Joe Barnes, can I go to you next? You've been looking at some of the diplomatic and political updates around the war. Joe Barnes.
Thanks, David, and yeah, good to hear your voice for so long. So let's start with an interesting one, which is adding to this idea that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and his top general, Valery Zaluzhny, have been at some sort of loggerheads. So Volodymyr Zelensky has now been accused of bypassing Zaluzhny by communicating directly with subordinate officers. So the Ukrainska Pravda newspaper has reported that President Zelensky has set up parallel lines of communications with Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, who is the head of the ground forces, and Lieutenant General Mykola Oleshuk, who is head of the Air Force. And these lines of communications were said to basically go over Zaluzhny's head. And this is what a source, a person who the newspaper claimed was a person close to Zaluzhny's inner circle, said. There is an impression that Zelensky has divided the armed forces into 2 groups. The good ones, commanded by Syrsky and other favourites, and the bad ones who subordinate to Zaluzhny. This greatly demotivates the commander-in-chief and, most importantly, prevents him commanding the entire military. So this report is the latest in what has been a spiralling issue and tensions between the 2 men after General Zaluzhny's interview with The Economist, where he basically said that the war had reached a stalemate, and he said the war would remain at a stalemate until there was the introduction of a new technology that was able to sort of move the lines from either Russia or Ukraine. So yeah, it's interesting to see how the politicians versus the generals fight seems to be going on as times are tough in Ukraine. So the counteroffensive didn't return the desired sort of results, and Ukraine's heading into a long and hard winter. So yeah, it just seems to be a bit more of that. Then let's move on to a claim by Ukraine's SBU security services that it had stopped former President Petro Poroshenko, sorry, that's an autocorrect in my notes, from leaving the country on grounds that Russia had planned to exploit a scheduled meeting between Poroshenko and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. So Poroshenko's political party, European Solidarity, said the former president had planned meetings in Poland and the United States and warned that the SBU was becoming involved in politics. Poroshenko was turned away at a border post while trying to leave Ukraine on Friday. Remember, you can only leave via road and rail at the moment, or ships as well, but not many people take that as a passenger route. So an SBU statement said he had planned the meeting with Viktor Orban, who is considered Russia's closest ally in Europe. Hungary opposes EU sanctions on Russia, but has not blocked more than a dozen EU packages so far. It does not send weapons to Ukraine and continues to buy fossil fuels from Moscow. And you'll remember Viktor Orban was pictured shaking hands with Vladimir Putin recently, the first sort of Western leader to do that since the outbreak of the war. And here is what the SBU had to say. So open quote, Russia planned to use the meeting, like other working meetings with representatives of countries voicing pro-Russian narratives, in psychological operations against Ukraine. Orban, the SBU said, systematically holds an anti-Ukrainian position, is a friend of Putin, and seeks the removal of sanctions imposed on Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. So under martial law, Ukrainian officials must first secure approval to travel abroad. So technically men of fighting age are blocked from leaving, but they also have stopped politicians basically going overseas amid fears of corruption. There's been quite a few sort of reports of high-ranking officials, whether they be in sort of regional or governmental, leaving to basically conduct dodgy business overseas while the war effort is happening, or even going on holiday, which is an interesting one. So the Parliament's Deputy Speaker, Alexander Koryenko, said Poroshenko's permission had been cancelled after he'd received a letter, and he said he would not comment on that letter.
Just to jump in there, Joe, eagle-eyed listeners will remember that I spoke to Alexander Kornienko at the Labour Party conference pretty much about this issue, as other sources of ours inside Ukraine's parliament had brought up this issue, that they felt that they hadn't been able to travel abroad to do their business, yet politicians from Sluha Narodnya were able to. So this is an issue which we've actually been reporting on for some time now. But Joe, let's continue. What's going on outside of Ukraine?
Yeah, so elsewhere, the warnings are starting up ahead of this month's European Council summit in Brussels, which quite frankly is going to be massive for Ukraine. So first of all, there are divisions over the bloc's finances, which risk leaving Ukraine short of a planned €50 billion package of support. And then you have the Hungarian opposition to Ukraine being allowed to start its formal membership talks to join the EU. So first on Hungary, the opposition is well known. Viktor Orban wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter, over the weekend that the European Commission's proposal for the talks to start, that's the accession talks for Ukraine, have no place on the European Council meeting's agenda. He argued letting Ukraine into the EU goes against the bloc's taxpayers, but also its farmers. So the expectation, if Ukraine is allowed to join, it's going to be the poorest country in the EU. So it will receive lots of taxpayer-funded support. And also, it is one of the biggest agricultural producers in Europe. It's known as sort of, the breadbasket of the world. So lots of the EU's farmers, and there have been sort of protests in various different parts of the world, mainly the neighbouring countries where farmers feel they're being outdone by business from Ukraine, would be affected. But let's look at this more closely. I've been watching the EU now. I've been based in Brussels for almost 6 years. Was watching it beforehand as part of my job. And actually, this one is a really hard one to guess what happens on. I normally have a pretty good accuracy rate when it comes to calling decisions at an EU level. So Hungary itself has a tradition of not following through on publicly discussed threats in the behind closed doors portions of these EU Council meetings. But this time the stakes feel and seem a little bit different. So I spoke to a series of Hungarian ministers recently on a trip to Budapest, and this time they all insisted they could not be bought with concessions. So lots of, whether it not be on Ukraine, but other issues, Hungary has always been perceived as one of these countries where it will act tough, it will act like a bad boy, all in order to secure more concessions. And often on various different, not just Ukraine, on day-to-day EU matters, that is often the case. But this time, the warnings from the Hungarian politicians I spoke to, so government ministers, defense minister, like they were all like, yeah, we can't be bought with concessions. So let's see. And then there is a battle over the 100 billion euro top up to the EU's budget, which is being discussed and requested from the European Commission at the moment. Half of that is earmarked for Ukraine. So here there are a few problems. You have the recent election victory by the far-right populist leader Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. He is super Eurosceptic, so clearly wouldn't back extra spending if he was head of the Netherlands government. But currently he hasn't formed the government. But the Dutch caretaker government, led by Mark Rutte, the long-time prime minister, do have to sort of look and consider Geert Wilders' stance. If he was to make a government, he is sort of favourite to become prime minister as it stands, but those coalition talks are going to take some time. And then there are concerns over a recent decision by the Constitutional Court of Germany in Karlsruhe that ruled that the government in Berlin had triggered a debt break, which is written into Germany's constitution. It has led to the cancellation so far of sort of 60 billion euros worth of planned projects on green and industrial projects. While Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has said support for Ukraine is cemented and concrete, but other commitments can't be guaranteed, including the EU cash, which obviously brings questions over whether Germany can fund these extra budget commitments to the EU. So I will quickly just run through, which I didn't actually plan to do, but it segues into this nicely. I wrote a story, it was in Saturday's newspaper, about Germany seeking to reduce the amount it gives to a 20 billion euro planned fund for Ukrainian weapons. So I managed to obtain a leaked document. It was a confidential non-paper. In it, Berlin argues the European Peace Facility should take into account billions in military aid that it has donated to Kyiv bilaterally. So far, for context, the EPF, the European Peace Facility, has donated some 4.5 billion euros worth of weapons to Ukraine and has helped drill 34,000 Ukrainian troops as part of an EU training mission. But yeah, this German document, which is a non-binding positional paper, essentially, has raised some eyebrows because Berlin in it says military support for Ukraine can be provided either through financial contributions to the Ukraine envelope in the EPF or as direct deliveries of military equipment. The document adds that in-kind contributions should be fully credited against a member state's agreed contribution to the Ukraine envelope. So Germany currently contributes about a quarter of the funds towards the EPF. So the EPF was essentially ceased. This 20 billion fund would cease to exist if Germany was to count its bilateral aid towards its contributions to this, essentially. You only have to sort of look at last month, Germany announced that it would double its military aid to Ukraine. That's bilateral military aid, signing off on an 8 billion euro package. So yeah, that's just under half of the 20 billion. So yeah, that wouldn't exist with that. Then let's go to more funding issues. And yeah, there's been a stark warning from the White House that US funding to Ukraine will run out by the end of the year if Congress and the Senate don't pull their fingers out and back Joe Biden's idea to give Ukraine more money in weapons, etc. So a letter from Shalanda Young, who's the White House's budget director, to congressional leaders warns that Russian gains on the battlefield would be more likely if Congress doesn't approve any new money for Ukraine. And in this letter, she writes, without congressional action by the end of the year, we will run out of resources to procure more weapons and equipment for Ukraine and to provide equipment from US military stocks. There is no magical pot of funding available to meet this moment. We are out of money and nearly out of time. So Joe Biden has requested some $106 billion in emergency funding for his foreign policy priorities, and they include Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific. But hardline Republican politicians, as I said, in the Congress, have refused to back any more US aid for Ukraine. So Shalinda Young, the budget director, she adds, cutting off the flow of US weapons and equipment will kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and not only putting at risk the gains Ukraine has made, but increasing the likelihood of Russian military victories. Already, our packages of security assistance have become smaller and the deliveries of aid have become more limited. While our allies around the world have stepped up to do more, US support is critical and cannot be replicated by others. And then let's go to Bulgaria, where it's a slightly less amount of money, but another blockage in support for Ukraine. So in Bulgaria, the president has vetoed a deal to supply Ukraine with 100 armoured vehicles. The country's parliament had agreed a deal to send these older armoured vehicles alongside the armaments and spare parts to run them for free. But yeah, Bulgaria's sort of president has overruled his sort of prime minister, who's an ardent backer of Ukraine. So Bulgaria's parliament can overturn the president's decision, but that requires a majority decision, which we're yet to see at the moment. And I will stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for talking us through all of that. There's a huge number of updates, far more than potentially I'd anticipated when we started preparing today's podcast. So thank you so much for all that research. James Kilner, can I come to you next? You've been looking at Ukrainian and Russian stories over the weekend. Where would you like to start?
Hi, David. Yep, another busy weekend on the desk. So let's start with a story that Joe was talking about. This is the sort of politics are back in very much back in Kiev story, and there was a very strong example of this over the weekend. It was the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, gave a couple of interviews to European journalists in which he openly criticised Zelensky. And that in itself wasn't such a surprise. I mean, he's been a political ally of Zelensky to some extent since the war started, but he's a supporter of Poroshenko, and they're definitely not aligned in peacetime. But it was his language that was so important and so worth keeping an eye on and pricking your ears up about. He was saying that Zelensky was basically sort of moving towards an autocratic style of government. The central government was getting too strong, and that the only bastion stopping Ukraine becoming an autocracy in many ways were the strength of the local mayors, etc. Obviously, talking up his own book here, he's the biggest local mayor in the country. And he's also saying that Zelensky was becoming more unpopular and that he would eventually pay for his mistakes. Now, this is definitely code for his time in office is numbered. He did make the point that he wouldn't be calling for him to resign during the war, but nonetheless, Klitschko is definitely saying that we're going to see a post-Zelensky Ukraine sooner rather than later. It is important to caveat this by saying that opinion polls still show strong support for Zelensky. And when I made a couple of calls yesterday about this to people in Kiev and Odessa, they said that the president still has by far the majority of support, etc. And although the counteroffensive has effectively failed and stalled, and Zelensky's finally admitted this, he still retains the support of the people. But nonetheless, he's under serious pressure, probably more pressure than he has been under since the start of the war, since February and March 22. And it also comes at a time where he seems to be losing a bit of popularity among some of the international leaders that's so important for the Ukrainian war effort, the arms suppliers, who are getting maybe a bit irritated with him. So all these things are coalescing, and there are definitely problems in Kiev and infighting. There is meant to be an election next year in Ukraine, presidential election. This is likely not to happen, and this again is becoming a flashpoint. And it just so happens that at the same time, roughly the same time, there is, on March the 17th, most likely to be a Russian election, which Vladimir Putin is almost 100%, will win. He hasn't yet declared his candidacy. It's probably happening next week. But this infighting in Kiev and in Ukraine really strengthens Putin, which I'll come on to a bit later. So interesting story there. In itself, not particularly surprising, but the language and the timing is still very important.
Thank you so much, James. Well, let's move to Russia then. You wrote a very interesting story about some of the protests, really, in Russia that are calling Vladimir Putin a liar. What's happening there?
Right, so regular listeners to this podcast, David, will of course remember that I spoke about this at some length a couple of weeks ago. I think it was one of the first reports in English on this group called Put Domoy, which means the way home or the path home. And it's, to recap very quickly for those who missed that, it's a grassroots organisation by wives and mothers of soldiers mobilised mainly in September 22 when there was partial mobilisation. And Russia dragged in about 320,000 men to fight in the front lines in Ukraine. This was at a time when the Russian army was very much on the back foot and was getting pushed back pretty much everywhere in Ukraine. And Putin badly needed to change the momentum of the war, and he did this through this mobilization, having promised people that the war, this special military operation that he calls it, would not impact ordinary lives. He then mobilized and basically called everyone out. Now, at the time, Russian recruitment officers basically said, "Oh, unless they're professional soldiers or they've specifically put up their hand, they won't be sent to frontline fighting, and they'll be back in a few months." None of this, of course, as we know, has come to pass. And the men who were recruited then are still on the front line. They've rarely had a break. They've done 15 months of warfare, etc. And the mothers and wives and sisters or whatever of these men are just getting incredibly upset, and they want them to have a break. Now, people who listen to this podcast are basically, well, what's this got to do with the war in Ukraine, so to speak? Well, what it's done is created a weakness for Putin. He does have this group of women who are starting to call him out. Now, this is important in Russian society because the women, the wives, and mothers of soldiers generally have a credibility and a voice in society that other people don't have. And the biggest instance of this was in the 1980s around Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, when these women mobilized and were able to put some pressure on the Kremlin to persuade them to withdraw out of Afghanistan. It wasn't the decisive factor, but it was a factor. So the Kremlin is aware of this backstory. And they seem to be getting a bit irritated and a bit nervous. This group, Putin, they have released, they're using this Telegram social messaging system to recruit people, to build momentum. They've released some sort of manifesto, they called it, this week, in which they actually called Putin a liar. They said they've been betrayed by the motherland. They said, how can Putin stand up in front of everyone and call 2024 the year of the family when fathers are dying on the front line, etc. And they also criticised the Russian military's use of convicts, murderers, rapists, etc., who then get released back in society after a 6-month tour of combat and in many cases kill and rape again, etc. So with all this in mind, the Kremlin has started, and this is really where the update from 2 weeks ago is the manifesto has been released. This group has tried to call for some sort of flash mobs and potential demonstrations in Moscow. Of course, we know that protesting in Russia is basically banned. Certainly all criticism of the war is banned, and this group is not anti-war. They've been very careful not to be anti-war. They're just very angry with the way the mobilization's been treated, which is in itself tipping onto the sort of anti-war, anti-Kremlin stance. But the point is, the Kremlin's propagandists have now started to call out this group. They've called them agents of Western intelligence units. They've called them their Telegram channels fakes. They've called them liars, all this sort of thing. British military intelligence has also said that the Kremlin is paying off some potential wives and mothers not to join this group, etc., etc. This is all the Kremlin mobilizing to snuff out, to stamp out what it sees as a potential threat ahead of this election next year that Putin wants to use to showcase and parade himself as one of Russia's great war leaders. So, we've seen mothers and wives groups pop up before in Russia since the start of the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and Dagestan in September 22 around mobilization. There was some fierce women protesting in the streets. They got stamped out by the local police, and there was another group in Russia's regions around about this time last year which also cropped up and had its leaders detained. So it's definitely going to be worth watching. There is definitely a weakness in the system here. This is a very rare form of protest, which is very important to monitor in Russia, and the Kremlin is monitoring it, and I think so should we.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. Let's talk quickly, I think, about one more aspect of this, of repression and moving against activists that the Kremlin disapproves of, or people who make them very nervous. And I know Jem might want to speak about this later as well. But James, you wrote up a story on the weekend about the story that the police in Russia have been raiding gay nightclubs in Moscow. Could you tell us about this?
Yeah, sure. So this is really a sort of culmination of a decade-long policy that Putin's had to harass and essentially criminalize. I mean, homosexuality in Russia was decriminalized in 92 or 93. So it's not illegal, but it is illegal to promote. It was made illegal in 2012 or 2013, I forget exactly, to promote so-called gay rights propaganda. And on Thursday, the Supreme Court in Russia banned this non-existent nefarious group called the International LGBT Movement, which actually doesn't exist. Now, analysts that I've been speaking to and people who know Russia, etc., consider this a Kremlin ploy to create, sort of target a nefarious group, which will ban a nefarious group as extremist, so there's some level of some sort of international terrorist group, and which means that anyone who's charged with being associated with that group can be sent to prison. Now, analysts and journalists consider this a deliberate attempt by the Kremlin to create ambiguity, which the security forces can then use to basically arrest LGBT supporters or gay people, etc., and throw them in prison. It wants to do this for two reasons. It wants to create this schism between the West, where the Kremlin wants to create a schism between the West, which is propaganda like to portray as some sort of pronoun-obsessed, multi-ethnic, wokeist West, which has gone soft and is reprehensible, compared to Russia, which is upholding traditional Slavic family values. That's the mission. And by targeting the gay community, it really shines a light on this strategy. And then the other reason is that it considers the sort of underground scene in Russia, bars, nightclubs, people with alternative lifestyles, this sort of thing, as a potential weakness, as a vulnerability. Not like the wives of men who've been mobilised that we've been talking about. They're mainstream and they're angry. That we're talking about some sort of underground sort of groups of people underground who meet up in bars and nightclubs and grumble and maybe more pro-West than the Kremlin likes them to be. We know that in March early this year, police raided quite a few bars in St. Petersburg and Moscow, shut them down, and these were considered as some sort of underground bars as well. And I think that this sort of attack on the gay community in Russia, and many of the gay community are planning to leave, and the raids on Friday night, which came 24 hours after this Supreme Court ruling, and during the raids, the police photographed hundreds of people's passports, so they got their names, etc., the people who've all been at these nightclubs, as a warning. I think it's also about clamping down on this underground sort of conversation which is going on in Russia, which might be anti the Kremlin, but just force underground. So there's two reasons there, David, and definitely a story to look out for, and has a very strong war focus as well as a very strong human rights and gay rights focus.
Well, thank you so much, James, for talking us through all of those updates. Let's now go to our guest. Just to reintroduce her, Jen Stout is a journalist from Shetland who's covered the war in Ukraine since March 2022. Prior to the full-scale invasion, she was working in Moscow on a fellowship and has previously worked for the BBC and specialises in long-form reporting. She's also a radio producer and a photographer. Her work from Ukraine was shortlisted in the Foreign Press Association Awards. Jen, thank you so much for coming into the office and joining us today. I've introduced you there, but could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work in Ukraine for our listeners?
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I do wear many hats. I'm doing radio and photos and text. I do quite a lot of live radio reports, usually for BBC outlets when I'm in Ukraine. And I did used to work for BBC Scotland, and I was actually a radio presenter and producer in Shetland. So it's really nice to be back in a radio studio. It feels like home. I had my entire life has really been focused on Russia and on Eastern Europe since I learnt Russian in high school in Shetland, which you can't do anymore, sadly. And it was a long obsession, I suppose. It took me too long to get there for various reasons, and I finally got to Moscow in November 2021. Things were really already closing down to a large degree. I couldn't really do a lot of reporting for various reasons, and obviously I wasn't there long before we had to leave. The fellowship was ended quite abruptly just a few days after the full-scale invasion. I wanted to leave anyway. Morally, I didn't want to stay in the country. We ended up I went to Vienna, and from Vienna I decided to go to Romania, to the southeast on the Danube, which is a border crossing on the Danube River, where thousands of people were coming from Odessa and Mykolaiv. And because I can speak reasonable Russian, and they were kind enough to speak Russian with me, I covered that border post for a few weeks, got a bit of training, and then went to Odessa Odessa, and things sort of went from there. So I ended up doing 2 further trips, 2 months at a time in Ukraine, on a shoestring budget, I'd say, and being very freelance, which kind of suited me because I like to stay in one place for quite a while, get a feel for things, really understand what's going on. And I suppose that allowed me to do more in-depth, long-form reporting, where you're trying to highlight the importance of history in this war, or rather history's abuse and misuse, the long context and identities and loyalties and all these thorny issues, which you can tell so much better through stories than diatribes.
Well, Jen, could you tell us a little bit more about your reporting then? What stands out in your memory? I know you spent quite a bit of time around Kharkiv.
I did. So I'd been to Kharkiv 2018, just on a holiday in November in the snow, because that's my idea of a holiday. And I'd met all these fantastic people. I just went on my own, met all these incredible people who were activists and artists and musicians and writers. And they were, even at that time, a lot of them were involved in supporting the army, in fundraising for the army. And sometimes that meant fundraising for militias they were then already part of the army, but there's a long history of that. And they were perhaps right-wing militias, and these were LGBT activists. And they would explain to me the potential of a Russian invasion is so much worse for us than holding our nose and helping out these guys. And I think it's those kind of, that really, you really have to sit back and say, gosh, I've never had to make that kind of choice, right? So I learned a lot from these guys. I went back to, Kharkiv, obviously, in the early days of the war, it was, you remember, it was so heavily bombed by aeroplanes. The city centre, which is so beautiful and historic and unique, was very heavily damaged. And my friends were still there. Most of them didn't leave. They were baking bread and dashing out in between bombardments to deliver bread to metro stations and to soldiers. And so when I went back to Kharkiv, it was the 1st of May, I think, 2022. And there had been a bit of a lapse in the bombing. It wasn't too dangerous by some standards. And it was very shocking to see what had been done to it, and shocking to be in this sort of huge bustling city, but it was completely dead silent. There were very few people there at that time. But it also was so much easier to be there. It's very hard to explain, but worrying from afar was much worse than being there and actually seeing my friends again and giving them a big hug. And then reporting. I reported a lot from Kharkiv over the months, over that year, also from the villages around Kharkiv. And I suppose one thing that really sticks in my mind is in that early period in May, someone invited me to this secret bunker gig, and it was a concert with Serhiy Zhadan, the poet and rock star, and a bunch of Kharkiv musicians, and they were live streaming to another party in Berlin. The whole point, as with everything at that time and now, was to raise money for the army. And so I go in this bunker, and it felt a little bit like being in like an East London squat like 15 years ago, those things that don't exist anymore. This kind of really great atmosphere, really interesting people, and this great sense of purpose, and a lot of solidarity, a real feeling of solidarity, which is what I found all the way throughout Ukraine. And that was an incredible moment to be there, because it really made me think about war and about fighting and about my own knee-jerk pacifism, that it's so easy to hold that position when you've grown up in absolute peace and stability, right? You never really have to think about it. But what struck me in that bunker was that my friends there and the people I was meeting, when they talk about money for the army, it's not some distant army. It's their relatives, their dads and their mums and their uncles. And if they can earn them another 10 quid by doing another song and trying to get some more people to donate, that means they might get night vision goggles when a Russian soldier is shooting at them. It doesn't get more personal and real than that. So there were a lot of instances like that really helped me to change my thinking, or just understand what my thinking was when I hadn't had to think about that before.
Jen, some of your stories you've picked up from people on the move, either refugees leaving Ukraine or on the move within Ukraine itself. Could you talk to us about your experiences of Ukrainian night trains? We talked briefly about this before we came on air, and I don't know if Joe's got experience of this as well, but certainly the Ukrainian night trains I've taken have been rather interesting. What have you found?
Yeah, they're fantastic. A very good argument for nationalised rail services, one could argue. The night trains are affordable. You get a cup of tea and a coffee. You can lie down on an actual bunk. It's mind-boggling to imagine that in this country. So I relied on night trains very heavily because you're crossing such massive distances, and I didn't have much of a budget. And they're also, as you say, a really, really good way to meet people, particularly in third class in the Platzkart, which is an open carriage with about 48 bunks. So it's a kind of sea of feet and people, and it can get terribly hot, but it is brilliant for meeting people and talking to people. And I took a lot of these journeys. The one that sticks in my mind, though, was a train that was almost empty because it was going from Odessa to Kharkiv on that end of April 2022. And it was, I remember being on the station, like blackout in Odessa at the station at night, waiting for this train and asking people, because you couldn't, there was no light at all, and saying, is this the train to Kharkiv? And this woman saying, no, why would Kharkiv, it barely exists anymore, why would you go there? And it's just a reminder that, like these perceptions of different cities and how badly they've been affected exist both in the West and within Ukraine themselves. And people often tell you, oh, that place just doesn't exist. And you think, no, I can get a train there, actually. But yes, on that train there was a conductor, a really young guy called Artem, and he was a native of the Kharkiv region, of the oblast. And he just spoke so seriously. We were watching the sort of lovely scenery go by in spring day, and he spoke about his job with Ukrzaliznytsia being his part in the war effort, because, as we all remember, and still today, the trains were such a massive, crucial part of the resistance, both civilian and military, helping people move across the country. I remember the train was late because of some shelling somewhere, but there's a very dense network of tracks in Ukraine, thanks to sort of Soviet-era industrialization. And so the train was a little bit late. It just diverted onto other tracks, and this young man was so apologetic. And again, I just, comparing it with trains here just made me have a laugh, and I told him, and he thought it was funny too.
I would say your experience sounds wonderful. When I went from Kiev to Lutsk on the night train, because of my faffing around and losing the ticket, which I'm sure at some point the entire story will come out. I don't think I'm ready. I don't think Dom Nichols actually is ready for this to come out either, but I wasn't served a tea after my performance there. So your experience sounds a lot smoother. And I'm sure Joe will want to come in a bit later and explain some of his experiences on Ukrainian trains. But Jen, can we move to something a little, really, I say sadder, it's just utterly tragic. I explained before we came on air that the last time we interviewed Victoria Amelina was I think in April, and she was killed by a Russian missile. I believe her death was announced at the beginning of July. One of the things that's clearly struck you, and I can see this through your reporting in your time in Ukraine, is the role of writers like her in this war. Could you talk to us about that? What do you mean by that, and what have you discovered?
The role of writers is something I realised because when I fell by accident into the Lviv Book Forum, the book festival. It was happening in 2022, despite the situation, it was happening in person. And I sort of got a lift across the border with some foreign writers. And it was really this incredible gathering where I got to meet and hear from a lot of Ukrainian writers, poets and playwrights and novelists. And of course, one of them was Victoria Amelina, who was an extraordinary person. Everybody's irreplaceable, of course, but the gap that Victoria leaves is quite hard to fathom. She had such an influence on so many people. She did not take herself that seriously. She made me laugh an awful lot, but she was extraordinarily clever, and she had this ability to sum up and explain to foreigners in particular the great sweep of very complicated 20th century history, especially in Ukraine and Russia and that part of the world, but with passion and with clarity. And it just leaves a gap that can't ever be filled. The Lviv Book Forum was an extraordinary time. They held it again the next year with Hay Festival, so you can actually go and sit in the basement in Lviv University and listen to people debate the future of Ukraine, debate the values on which the country is built on. And that's something I saw in Kharkiv a lot during air raid sirens and actual bombardments. There'd be people in basements saying, what are the values that our revolution was built on, and what about Maidan, and how do we carry this forward? Just an incredible cultural scene. It's so important. And I also, in Lviv, I met some of the PEN Ukraine guys, and so that's the Ukraine chapter of the International PEN organisation, the Writers and Freedom of Speech organisation, and they do what I would call a kind of literary activism, so they hire a minibus and they go off to deoccupied territories, particularly north of Kharkiv region and Donetsk region, and bring books to places where the Russians had burnt them all or destroyed the libraries. I ended up on a few trips with them, and I learnt so much. And I'm in their debt. And it really made me think about the role that they play in the war.
Jen, there's just one more question from me, but then I'll open the floor to James and Joe, who I know will have some thoughts and questions as well. But out of all of your reporting and travel in Ukraine, what stories do you think are underserved by us journalists? Where do you think we should be paying more attention to, potentially, that maybe we're not? As ever, I think it's depth. I think it's context that sometimes we miss in our rush to report. Breaking news is important. News is important. I'm a journalist. But sometimes I think particularly going back to stories, we're not so good at.
I remember, I mean, you probably remember it too, Fergal Keane did this quite a lot, and he had spent a lot of time in Ukraine since the invasion in 2014, and he kept going back to see this one couple, Anatoly and Svetlana, and he just said clearly he just loved them. He was blown away by their hospitality, by the way that they dealt with life and everything that had been thrown at them. And he was going back to inform us about what happened to them and their lives. And I mean, of all the stories I've heard or read from Ukraine, that's the one that stuck with me, because it touches you emotionally, doesn't it? And rather than that thing of like, oh yeah, there's a story about someone and it's the worst day of their life, and then you never hear about them again. You don't know what happened next. I also think, I mean, what I'm particularly interested in, and I think isn't covered very much, is the context and history of Donbass and what that region actually means, actually is. And I think that's a really crucial question for the future of Ukraine, for Ukraine's unity and how the society is built, the nation is built in the coming years, is how did it end up like this, and what happened in the 20th century? This is all really crucial. And again, it's things that Victoria used to speak about a lot, because history is very much alive and burning in this current situation.
Well, thank you so much, Jen, for answering my questions. Joe Barnes.
Thanks for joining us. And lots of stories about trains, including people often ignoring the air raid sirens and standing on the platform not to miss their train, which is I always find quite amusing, how sort of people shut their ears off to the sirens the longer they're in Ukraine for. But I wanted to ask you, I know you said to David beforehand, you're not a military expert and you don't want to sort of speculate how the war's going to go, but what about how are people feeling about it in Ukraine? It's been a while since I've been, but you hear a lot more pessimism now. Like the counteroffensive didn't come up with the right results that everyone wanted. Sort of on the diplomatic side, like confidence is low. But what is the sort of the morale like in Ukraine at the moment? Do you feel?
It's a difficult one because they don't have any choice. None of the people I know are going to turn around and say, "Do you know what, lads? This has all gone on a bit too long, hasn't it? And it's a bit miserable. So let's give it up." I mean, they don't have any choice. It's completely existential, kind of life or death, exist or don't exist. So there's no. I haven't heard among people that I talk to regularly a sort of criticism of the Ukrainian government or of Zelensky. They're just. I think there's more frustration with the West and the conversation that we have here with this kind of, the fatigue, we're so fatigued. And as, Timothy Snyder so succinctly describes, I think on the podcast yesterday, this idea of the stalemate being such a bad analogy, such a lazy analogy, and says far more about our psychological, slightly childish reactions to a war taking a long time, as of course it does. So I think nobody was really under massive illusions that it was going to be over quickly. Of course, there was the counter-offensive last year, but I didn't know anyone in Ukraine who just thought that could be repeated and they would just be taking back Crimea quickly, except maybe some people in the West who were in the west of Ukraine who are a little bit more distant from the war. But I spent more time in Kharkiv and Donetsk region, and there people are very grimly pragmatic, I'd say.
And could you just tell us a bit about life in Kharkiv? I was there last time I was there. It's the city I've spent a bit of time in over the years. And it was slowly building back to life from the last two times I've been there. And I think the zoo was set to open and stuff like that. So what is life like in Kharkiv at the moment?
Well, I've not been in Ukraine for 8 months because I've been writing a book, but I'm going back on Thursday, happily, very happily. I mean, obviously I keep in touch with people there. They're, as I say, very stoic. They know that there's going to be energy strikes probably. Russia will start trying to freeze them into submission, which won't work because it didn't before. They've got their generators ready. They know it's going to be a bit tough, but they'll keep going. Nobody really wants to leave. And I remember that thing where Kharkiv went from being an almost silent city to one where it was bustling and the trams were working again. That was an incredibly exciting day. The trams got up. One of the main questions in Kharkiv at the moment is rebuilding and reconstruction. And these conversations are going on, even though the war is still going on and there is still strikes in Kharkiv. And it has to be. And that's really where it gets very interesting, where the politics get interesting. Is this going to be a more democratic process, or is it going to be a sort of top-down international investors, Norman Foster, plate glass everywhere process? I think most of the people in Kharkiv I know would be not in favour of the latter, I'd say.
Jen, I've got a quick question, if I may. I mean, thank you very much. Really enjoyed your thoughts. Really thoughtful and really interesting. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book next year. But the image of these book activists, these going out and taking books back to areas around Kharkiv, which had been recaptured by the Ukrainian army last summer. And you said he learned a lot. Can you describe the reaction to people they found in the recaptured areas, the sort of older, poorer people who may have been trapped and unable to leave, when they were given books, and what it meant for them? I mean, presumably these books were in Russian rather than Ukrainian?
No, the books are in Ukrainian. That's very much the point. Yeah, very much the point.
But could the people in that predominantly Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, could they read the books if they're in Ukrainian?
Yes, of course. I think this is a big misconception, misunderstanding about Eastern Ukraine. Everyone there can speak Ukrainian. Everyone I've met, I've asked many people about this because I've written extensively about the language issue, the language politics. People are taught Ukrainian in school. They have been for a long time. And it's not a problem for people to be able to speak and talk in Ukrainian. It's more of a political point and something that's stirred up a lot by the Kremlin, the recent years of decommunization, perhaps changing street names, removing some of the glorification of Soviet history, and Russian language being all bound up in that, of course. So no, the books are in Ukrainian or in English, actually. Most of it was, at the time that I was watching them do this, it was English books as well for little kids to get into English, because that's what a lot of them wanted to do. And it was really joyous. It's a children's author, Katerina. I remember her going to libraries and doing events with kids. And it might sound like they actually need gas and heating and more supplies. And they absolutely did. But they also need to have fun. And they need to have contact and feel like people from the west of Ukraine are caring about them and talking to them. They also, on the trip that I went with them, this was late last year, we went to the village where Volodymyr Vakulenko had lived, and we met his mum and stepdad and his son Vitalik. Volodymyr went missing during the occupation in March that year, and they were still hoping at that time that he was in prison somewhere, but it turned out later that they had just tortured and shot him and left him on the side of the road. So that was part of what PEN Ukraine were doing as well, was trying to help Olena, his mother, and get this story out as well, like tell this story. And because of my luck in sort of falling in with him, I met Olena and I kept in touch with her for a long time, covered that story for the New Humanist. And again, Victoria Amelina was hugely helpful in me understanding the context of Ukrainian writers being persecuted by Russia. This is nothing new at all. This is a long story.
Well, thank you very much. That's, really interesting. It sounds like some great reporting. We look forward to reading it in your book. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Joe and James. Jen, James there mentioned your book. Can you tell us about it? What's the title? What's it about? And what have you chosen to write about?
Yes, happily. So the title is Night Train to Odessa. It will come out on the 2nd of May next year. The book came about, so deeply reported features are my great love. This is what I love doing. Every story you get, you say, oh God, that would be so interesting if I could just stick on that. And that was always my thing. And I thought, well, with a book, it's really just going even deeper. It's a story about a person going to report on a war. But within that, there's many other people's stories too. And it's a snapshot in time. It's me going to Russia. Russia part is quite brief because I was only there for a few months and I wasn't reporting there. So it's more impressions, what it was like to be in that society as we edged towards war, that kind of very weird contrast in Moscow where nobody was talking about it, but all my Ukrainian friends were talking about it because they were, in Kharkiv, they were 40 kilometres from this massive build-up of Russian troops. So, the very jarring reality of being in Moscow at that time, then reporting in Romania and reporting throughout Ukraine. There's many people's stories, and many of the characters are sort of people that I became very good friends with. It's not geopolitics. It's not a sort of a history book. There's been a lot of fantastic history books out recently. But I am very interested in the history of Ukraine, of that region. And I think it's really important. But I do a kind of show, don't tell. So I try and tell this story through anecdotes, through places, because places for me are huge and I tend to fall in love with them. So there's a lot about Odessa, about north of Donetsk region and Kharkiv region. And hopefully, my hope is that I can I can make you fall in love with them too, with these places, which have the potential to be such wonderful, amazing places once there's peace.
Well, it sounds absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Jen. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Jen, we'll come to you last. So, Joe Barnes, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'm just reading the Washington Post has done a long read on the wangling before the counteroffensive was launched in Ukraine. and so I hope to finish it later today once I've done writing with you on the pod. But just some sort of the top lines from this, which I find are interesting, and it's more sort of disagreements between the US and Ukraine over how the counteroffensive should have been conducted. So Ukraine insisted on attacking in 3 prongs, 2 through the south, aimed at hitting the coast of Azov, and 1 around Bakhmut, where the US said they should have put all of their resources into a single push. And where it was, they seem to think that US military officials, after they conducted these tabletop games, sort of simulations, thought that Ukraine would have been able to reach the Sea of Azov and cut off Russian troops in the south in 60 to 90 days. But as we know, that's not happened. And it's just sort of interesting to see the fallout of as the offensive sort of culminates and comes to a sort of a spluttering end as sort of, now we're in the full depths of winter. That sort of, just the fallouts. And I just find reading these things to be, quite weird at times, that there's a lot of blame games where potentially they shouldn't be, because it's not the Western guys doing the fighting. They're just handing over the means of fighting to Ukraine. And it's Ukrainians losing their lives and limbs and loved ones, etc., for the cause. So it's just interesting to see, and I recommend reading that if you can.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you so much for your reporting today. James Kilner.
So, just to give listeners a brief update from the View from Riga, where I've been for about a week, which is obviously an important place for us to keep checking in on, because there's borders Russia and Belarus. And the view here is very much that Putin is sort of never been more dangerous since the start of the war. He's seen off this stalled counteroffensive in Ukraine. He's patched together his international credibility in Central Asia, signed deals with North Korea, Iran, rearmed, reorientated the Russian economy, etc., etc. He's amassing hundreds of thousands of men once again. And the view very much is, let's hope the West doesn't get too distracted with Israel and elections, etc. So, it's the View from Riga I'm going to leave you with, David.
Thank you very much, James and Joe. Jen, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
My last thought is, yes, let's listen to people in Riga and Estonia and Lithuania and Romania and Poland and all the people who actually have been warning of the danger of Russia for so many years, rather than getting stuck in our own slightly myopic safety and comfort over here and saying, oh gosh, isn't this going on a little bit too long?
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.